Pilots from the border unit Phoenix destroyed 4,000 unique Russian targets in March. One of these was a moving radio relay communication station. In addition, Ukrainian defenders eliminated artillery, field depots, and positions, and also delivered powerful strikes against enemy logistics. At the same time, the Ukrainian armed forces thwarted several Russian attacks. Among them was a massive armored assault in the Lyman direction. Where's the army? Russia lost several dozen pieces of armored equipment and nearly 2,000 Russian infantrymen, about 1,000 of whom were irrecoverable losses. The 81st Air Mobile Brigade of the 7th Air Assault Corps stopped the largest motorized assault in the Slavyansk direction since the beginning of the year. The Russian occupiers used 16 motorcycles, operating in several groups, but the attack was stopped by Ukrainian paratroopers, and the Russian infantry was eliminated. The situation in this direction remains difficult. The enemy is constantly pulling in resources and continues to try to seize more advantageous positions, using remote mining and drones. But the defense forces are detecting and destroying the invaders. At the same time, the Russian command has set deadlines for itself to capture Kostyantynivka in the Donetsk region, April 25th. However, Ukrainian soldiers consider these plans unrealistic. The soldiers of the 11th Army Corps note that the enemy is trying to enter the city directly and use the buildings for cover. And that means fighting in the city, which significantly slows down the advance. So far, flanking maneuvers haven't produced any results, so a quick capture of the settlement is unlikely, Ukrainian defenders say. According to the military, even with active assaults and the use of all available resources, the timeline could stretch out for several months, possibly until fall.
The enemy is trying to attack Kostyantynivka. Every day is hard, difficult work. They're waiting for the greenery, since everything will start blooming soon. That's why right now, we're also preparing to launch counterattacks. And it's especially important here that we're carrying out counterattacks. And we've had good results both in Bilobola and in Pokrov. Dubropol, a counterattack near Kostyantynivka. This isn't an offensive yet, not an active one, but it is already about destroying the enemy, advancing forward by even a few hundred meters, sometimes kilometers, and we're showing that the enemy has no prospects.
Meanwhile, in the Kostyantynivka direction, the defense forces repelled attacks by the Russian army near Plasheyevka, Ivanopilia, Stepanivka, Yablanivka, and Sofiivka. In the Pokrovsk area, fighting was taking place near several settlements. These included Belitskaya, Rodenskaya, Novo-Alexandrivka, Kotlina, Udachaya, Molodetskaya, and Filia. And on the Huliaipol section of the front, the Russians tried to push Ukrainian soldiers out of their positions near Varvarivka, Seleznychne, Horke, Svyatopetrivka, Yeleno-Kostyantynivka, and Mirne.
Right now, Russia is preparing for a new phase. A spring-summer offense, and as we said, the main target is Donbass. Donetsk region, overall, the task is impossible. I'll say it straight. Just regarding Pokrovsk, we've already counted together. I'm actually keeping specific statistics on operational data. Putin has ordered the capture of Pokrovsk 22 times since the fall of 2025.
Despite the aggressor's constant pressure along the entire Pokrovsk direction, units of the 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Air Assault Forces systematically disrupt the Russian army's plans and inflict significant losses on enemy personnel and equipment. Throughout March, Ukrainian paratroopers successfully repelled Russian motorized assaults in the areas of Mirnograd and Hryshine. Ukrainian units also replenished the exchange fund, destroyed Russian army logistics hubs, and reconnaissance assets. Over the course of the month, nearly 300 ammunition depots were hit, more than 9,000 drones, and 62 artillery systems were destroyed. More than 1,200 Russian occupiers were killed or wounded.
We are working to change the situation, to turn the tide at the front, one, and to change the enemy's mindset. Two, successes at the front are creating negative prospects for the Russians. They especially feel it when we launch our offensive operations, when so much is destroyed, sometimes 1,000, sometimes 600 in a single day. This is real, I mean it. A good question, a real practice. Such a huge number, both overall and specifically in a given area, disorganizes and demoralizes the Russians. They're ready to surrender, but not to die. This is already working at the front, and it's spreading down the line into the rear and even amongst the. They realize that taking part in the war is a one-way ticket with no prospects.
In the past 24 hours, Ukraine's defense forces have eliminated 1,060 Russian soldiers. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. The total losses of the enemy since the start of the full-scale war have already exceeded 1,298,000 soldiers. Yesterday, the defense forces destroyed 2 Russian tanks, 3 armored vehicles, and 59 artillery systems. They also burned 219 units of Russian vehicles and fuel trucks.
Joining us now is Pavlo Lakiychuk, head of military programs at the Center for Global Study Strategy 21. Hello, thanks for joining us.
Hello.
Good morning. Glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Pavel, well, here we are, 1,300,000. This is the number of Russian losses, both those killed and those who can no longer fight. Wounded, severely wounded, and so high. 1,300,000. These are the 1,300,000 who will never return to the front. How big of a loss is this for the Russians when we're talking about such a number?
Well, you could add a few 100,000 more to that. There are currently various kinds of armed deserters who are now wandering aimlessly around the occupied territories of Ukraine. These individuals terrorize the local Ukrainian population, while their very own colleagues from the Russian National Guard and other units are actively chasing after them. Although, if you take a much closer and more detailed look at what is currently taking place on the ground in the occupied territories of Ukrainian land, the so called Russian law enforcement agencies don't really want to work there in those regions at all. So, because of this situation, the real number could actually be significantly higher than what is being reported. Well, you can compare it to the fact that the current Russian army consists of about 1 million people. So, since 2022, the Russians have lost 1.5 active armies.
Regarding the goals of the Russian troops, the Russian command has set itself a new deadline, as you can see, for capturing now Kostyantynivka in the Donetsk region, April 25th. However, Ukrainian soldiers consider these plans unrealistic. The soldiers of the 11th Army Corps note that the enemy is trying to enter the city directly and use the buildings for cover. And that means fighting in urban conditions, which significantly slows down their advance. Flanking maneuvers have not yielded results so far, so a rapid capture of the settlement is unlikely, Ukrainian defenders claim. According to the military, even with active assaults and the use of all available resources, the timeline could stretch out for several months, up until the morning. How do you assess such deadlines? Why do they still exist in the Russian army? There is still a significant underlying basis for specific aggressive military intentions. So, what exactly would the Russian troops require if they intend to get involved by April 25th?
Well, they'd have to bust their asses, obviously. All these deadlines, well, it could be leaks from some Russian plans, more of the same. They make new ones, don't meet them, then make more. So there's really no point in getting too attached to them. More often than not, when something like this is officially announced to the public, it strongly suggests that this specific direction is being considered as one of the primary strategic directions. And indeed, right now, Kostyantynivka is currently one of the most critical and strategic directions of the ongoing Russian military offensive, especially now that they have either completely abandoned or, at the very least, postponed their previous attempts at a large scale strategic encirclement and containment of our defending forces. In Donetsk region, in the northwest of Donetsk, they're trying to take full advantage of any and all opportunities they have through a frontal assault. Siversk became such a clear and prominent indicator of the shift to frontal attacks. Now it's Konstantinovka. The situation there is really very difficult. The enemy is surrounding the city from three sides, and accordingly, it's becoming increasingly difficult and challenging for the defense forces to carry out their operations. Especially now, since the war has changed, it's a drone war, and it's actually easier to hold the defense, either in the wide open spaces in front of the settlement or further out past that point, behind the settlement, captured by the enemy. Urban combat continues to persist. The bloodiest kind. The most critical objective right now is not to let Russian groups infiltrate and move into the city and establish themselves there. If the enemy manages to establish a fortified position, it takes a lot more forces and effort to drive them out. Right at this very moment, there have been several specific cases where the Russian forces managed to break through, even sneaking into the very center of Konstantinovka. But when the various Z bloggers claim that our flag raisers have fully established themselves in the city, that is simply not true. For now, at the very least, they are being successfully pushed out of Konstantinovka. Exactly how things will develop from here, I am just not ready to say yet. I also can't say how many months Konstantinovka will hold out. Our job is not to give up our cities to the relentless and determined invaders. The ultimate strategic goal of the occupying forces is to advance forward at any cost. But how? And for how many more months or even years will it go on? This is the ongoing and brutal battle for Konstantinovka. Hardly anyone can say right now. It's definitely not going to happen in April.
Pavel, lately everyone has been talking a lot about the expansion of kill zones, both for the Ukrainian side and for the Russian side. A kill zone, in simple terms, is an area controlled by drones. Basically, it's a place where infantry can hardly enter. To what extent could this potentially make the situation even worse when it comes to the possibility of either side making any real progress? Are there actually any viable solutions available for this at the moment, so to speak?
There really aren't any solutions. Kill zone is just a shortened name for a guaranteed destruction zone. The name says guaranteed, but in reality, it's not always guaranteed and depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the weather conditions, among other things. It also depends on the density of forces and resources, not just drone operators on both sides, but also electronic warfare systems and their types. It really depends on the specific current weather conditions and the exact time of year, whether it's the middle of winter or perhaps during the early spring or late fall. Now that the greenery is starting to fill in, the situation changes once again. This critical process also determines exactly which specialized tools will be utilized in the field, including the specific types of advanced drones and the sophisticated firmware that powers them. In this rapidly evolving landscape, whoever manages to adapt to these technological changes faster and more efficiently will undoubtedly be the one who succeeds the most in the long run. Well, naturally, it is finally spring now, bringing with it a fresh set of challenges and opportunities for everyone involved in this industry. It is incredibly difficult to predict with any certainty what the kill zones will look like by this fall, because both the lethal means of destruction, meaning the drones themselves, and the drones used as spotters for other types of weapons are undergoing continuous and rapid technological advancements, practically in real time, each and every single day. And in 6 months, it's possible that the nature of combat operations will change significantly. Right now, well, in recent days, things have been relatively. It is highly advantageous and favorable for implementing the same tactical maneuvers that were frequently employed in common during the entire winter period. But yes, literally, in a week, the conditions will change drastically.
These changes depend. Do they depend on the enemy's tactics? The Russian army continues offensive operations near Lyman in the Donetsk region, but has changed its tactics after an unsuccessful assault. This was stated in a comment to RBC Ukraine by the spokesperson of the 3rd Army Corps, Alexander Borodin. He reported that large-scale mechanized attacks by the Russians are no longer being used. Instead, the invaders are operating in small infantry groups and sometimes using ATVs and motorcycles for quick maneuvers. Let's listen to the quote and then continue.
The offensive actions we've seen recently, and those that took place in 2022, maneuverable, mechanized blitzkrieg offensives by the Russians, have cost them dearly. After all, restoring equipment is quite an expensive undertaking. The Russian occupiers have chosen a tactic. It consists of disrupting our personnel's ability to rotate by carrying out these small-scale assaults. They don't count people, so from an economic standpoint, this is actually beneficial for them. Alexander Borodin, spokesperson for the 3rd Army Corps, in an interview with RBC Ukraine.
How do you see it? What is really behind the change in tactics? Is it possibly due to weather conditions somewhere, or is it actually a failure in their assaults?
I wouldn't compare it to 1922. That's not really accurate, because 1922 was about advancing a column. That was in the context of a breakthrough, a strategic breakthrough of defenses in several directions. And that's called advancing by march. The Russians haven't been able to advance by march for 3 years now. The war has shifted to positional defense. It's a highly sophisticated and deeply layered defensive system, and you can't just break through it. Simple armored columns are simply not enough to get you through. And over these 3 long years of positional warfare, the Russians have used, depending in part on the steady improvement of strike capabilities and the availability of the right weapons, a variety of different classic tactical approaches. These tactical methods basically range from heavy mechanized assaults to small unit infantry-led frontal assaults. And to say that they're completely abandoning their efforts on mechanized assaults wouldn't be entirely accurate, because from time to time, actually, even on the Lyman front, just a relatively short while ago, there was an attempt at a fairly significant and large scale. It was a fairly large mechanized assault, which was successfully repelled with very heavy and devastating losses for the enemy. These sporadic and relatively infrequent offensive attempts now occur in a shifting pattern that alternates with the relentless and unyielding pressure being applied by the enemy infantry, which consistently utilizes specialized infiltration tactics designed to exploit weaknesses in the defensive lines. Infiltration tactics. This term came about because of the fluidity of our defense. If a year or two ago there was significant discussion regarding the possibility of breaking through back when our comprehensive defensive infrastructure was built quite densely, now, however, our defensive positions have become very sparse, primarily due to a critical and widespread shortage of available personnel. That is exactly why this specific tactic of tactical infiltration is being utilized. It consistently delivers the greatest results for them, but it remains just as costly in terms of human resources. Breaking through this multi-kilometer kill zone, when it used to be just 1.5 kilometers, that's one thing. Back when the positions, say in Avdiivka, in 2023, the distance was 400 meters. Right now, situated directly between the enemy's forward positions and our own defensive lines, but now the distance between these positions can be anywhere from 6 up to 8 kilometers. That's the grays out. To successfully navigate across a full 8 kilometers without being detected or destroyed, and then to penetrate deep into our rear for that same distance, you can imagine just how hopeless that is under these conditions. With active defense going on.
How much does this overall ruin the Kremlin's plans? As bold as it may sound, the Russian occupiers really did want to take over all of Ukraine. Then their appetite shrank to just the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and now their ambitions are shifting again. Around settlements like Pokrovsk, Kostyantynivka, and Zapokrovsk, if I'm not mistaken, there have been active battles going on for more than 19 months now, and the Russians still haven't managed to fully take control there. And they're suffering huge losses. These constant failures, all the repeated missed deadlines set by the Kremlin's military leadership for their troops directly on the front line, could this somehow lead to a change in their overall offensive tactics? We can see that they just keep changing it. One moment they're trying to encircle a particular settlement, then they move in with heavy equipment, then with motorcycles, then with ATVs, and then with infantry. It's all over the internet. Different types of offensives, they all get destroyed by drones, by precise artillery, and by that same infantry. The counteroffensive actions that Syrskyi talked about, could this lead to further changes, Russian tactician? Or else, everything has been going on since the Second World War, since the time of the Red Army, and they are just coming in numbers. Remember, yes, this is a legendary story. One gun, 2 soldiers are pushing forward, simply in numbers for the motherland, for Putin.
Now, when it comes to tactics, compared to World War II, they have evolved significantly. But any tactical maneuvers are based on certain constants. These constants stay exactly the same. And combat operations are determined by a combination of different tactical maneuvers and their alternation. This is so that your opponents can't anticipate or predict your upcoming strategic moves. That's why, on the one hand, there's this very consistent and persistent trend in the way combat is carried out and conducted. On the other hand, every 4 to 6 months, maybe even more often now, it's hard to pinpoint an exact period, the entire situation begins to change. The nature of weaponry changes, and the overall appearance and look of the battlefield changes too. But it's the colonels who see us. The majors out there on the battlefield, Gerasimov, somewhere in his bunker. He doesn't see that anymore. He's got completely different arrows and totally different plans, which he reports to the Kremlin dictator, Putin, but he lives in a completely different world. And he's not the least bit concerned about the Russian army's staggering losses, whether in manpower or valuable military equipment and resources. He lives entirely within his own imagination. That's why, just about a year ago, or even just a few months ago, Putin was incredibly optimistic and confident when talking to Trump, like, all right, we will just have to see how it goes. He was sure that what Gerasimov was reporting to him, like, just give me 1 more month. I'll capture everything, crush all of Ukraine's armed forces, and then we'll have a clear path to Kyiv, to Dnipro, wherever you order. Putin trusts what he says, and Putin echoes his every word. As a direct result, the Russian army is now just struggling to make any real progress. None of Putin's closest international partners believe a word he says anymore at this point. He remains convinced of the effectiveness of his army, and as long as this Kremlin rat is convinced of that, they'll keep grabbing more and more people, throwing them onto the front lines in Ukraine. Simply in order to satisfy the senseless whims of the authoritarian Kremlin dictator.
Subscribe to UATV English and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.